Bonsoir et bienvenue. Welcome, everyone. We acknowledge that Concordia University is located on unceded indigenous lands. The Ganyang-Gahaga Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters we now call Montreal. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Conversations in Contemporary Art is a graduate seminar based in the MFA Visiting Artist Program. It provides a unique opportunity to hear dynamic and influential artists, critics, curators, and cultural workers speak. Through the series, seminar participants, as well as members of the public, get a chance to interchange with our guests and reflect on key themes in global contemporary art. I invite you to join us for the SICA lectures over the course of the semester and into next semester and into the distant future. This evening, we're welcoming Amanda Dawn Christie to the series. Amanda is an intermedia artist working in film, video, performance, photography, audio, transmission art, and electronics. After completing an extensive series of works about the RCI shortwave transmission site, including a film, interactive installations, photo series, radio works, and performances related to the site, she moved to Montreal, where she now continues her art practice while working as an assistant professor of intermedia, video, performance, and electronic arts at Concordia University. Concepts and themes explored in her work focus primarily on the relationship between the human body and analog technology in a digital age. Her work's been presented internationally, and she's currently working on a new ionospheric transmission project for the boundary of outer space. Woohoo! We're lucky to have her here before she blasts off into space. Please join me in welcoming Amanda Dawn Christie.
I won't be going into outer space. I might just be sending some things there. Thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. Is mic placement and volume okay? Awesome. So I'm excited to take you on a journey with me tonight into the intangible. My art practice, as Tamara mentioned, is fairly interdisciplinary. I work across different mediums. And I was originally going to start off talking about my experimental film practice, but I think it's much more interesting and exciting to talk about what I'm doing now and what I'm excited about, which is transmission arts. So, but it does take its root in my experimental film practice. So, I'm just going to set a timer here so I can see where I'm at. Here we go, a little stopwatch, like I'm running laps, because, yeah, that way I can just wing it, but know when to wrap it up. So my experimental film practice was, on one hand, very tangible. I approached 16 millimeter, Super 8, and 35 millimeter film like sculptural objects, like a craftsperson. For a little over a decade, I did a lot of handmade film, hand processing, optical printing. But I felt very strongly about not making commodified objects that could be bought or sold or owned. So there was this kind of interesting juxtaposition between a very material practice, but an intangible experience and outcome. For me, it was important that viewing my films was an experience that you could not revisit or own. So none of my work was available online. You couldn't purchase it, you couldn't own stills, nothing. I used to describe my film practice when I lived in Vancouver by saying that I made my work with the detritus of the capitalist entertainment industry because I would get scrap short ends from films that were shooting in Vancouver. I had a friend who worked at a lab who could get me chemistry, and I managed to just kind of make films very cheaply handmade. So what we're seeing here is kind of the transition of my work in experimental film into transmission art. And transmission art is a term applied to artists who make work about transmission or with transmissions, or works about the electromagnetic spectrum. So oftentimes people think of radio and they're like, oh, radio is kind of obsolete, we've all got the internet. But think about it, what is the internet, and what is Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and GPS and satellites communications? All of this is invisible waves passing around us all the time through our bodies. We are surrounded at all times with these waves, which I'm fascinated by. So this image is from one of my expanded cinema performances, where I would work with multiple film projectors and change the loops in real time, work with lenses and prisms. And this piece was called Transmissions. This is before I knew transmission art was a thing. And as you can see from the text, we're all unintentional witnesses, sites within the electromagnetic construction of these invisible architectures. And throughout this 20-minute performance, I had images of satellites and cell phones and laptops, because I was just kind of becoming obsessed with the fact that, you know, there's someone doing their banking through my body right now. Someone is breaking up with their partner through your body right now. Someone's ordering pizza through your body right now. Someone's uploading an essay. All this stuff is going on around us. And we talk a lot about landscape and territory and, you know, capitalism, which is all very object-based. But the electromagnetic spectrum is also fascinating because it's also highly regulated by the FCC, by CRTC. Bandwidths are bought and sold and licensed. And so I'm getting ahead of myself. So we'll get back to the art. So these are some stills from, this is 2009. So this is me performing transmissions. So I would perform in costume, changing loops, working with prisms. That led into this work, which is called Last Days of Snow. And it's about the end of analog television. So you're like, well, what's that have to do with transmission art? Well, analog television was transmitted in the AM bandwidth. So analog television, if you had rabbit ear antennas, you were receiving television over radio waves. And so in 2011, the CRTC announced they were replacing over-the-air analog TV with digital. And a lot of people were like, oh, well, progress, because digital's better. But it actually wound up disadvantaging a lot of people, especially the elderly, the impoverished, people in remote areas all of a sudden lost access to our public broadcasters. And why were they shutting down analog transmissions? It's because that section of the electromagnetic spectrum was being reallocated to digital service providers like cell phone companies. So what I did was I did a series of video performances where I would go out with this little battery-powered television waiting for the end. So this part of the series is called Last Days of Snow, Waiting for the End. And they're kind of like a series of dates where I'm there with the television, I'm never looking at it, and it's like a relationship that's ending. And it's kind of funny because I've never really watched a lot of TV, but I was kind of touched when it was ending. Because so all these loops are very slow, not much happens. They're all about 5 to 10 minutes long. And they're displayed, when displayed, they're on CRT monitors, cathode ray tubes. And the reason it's called Last Days of Snow is that when we switch to digital transmissions, the signal is either on or off. There's no in-between noise. And I was really fascinated by that in-between noise, that on or, because within that noise, that snow on your TV, 1% of that is residual radiation from the Big Bang, the beginning of the universe. And I love this idea that when you're trying to get the right channel, you're an unintentional witness to the beginning of the universe. And yet you're trying to get rid of it. You want a clean signal. But when we go to digital, it's binary, on, off. We lose that kind of connection to the ambiguity, that unintentional witnessing of the beginning of everything. So this part of the project, this is Last Days of Snow, Night Lights Like Fireflies. This is 2 days before the CRTC shut off the analog television transmissions. In Prince Edward Island, I hung 12 televisions in a tree. And it's called Night Lights Like Fireflies because at this point in time, everyone that summer was putting their CRT monitors out on the sidewalk, you know, for garbage pickup. And they looked so sad. They looked to me like you know, little dogs that have been put out of the house because they peed on the rug. And I had this kind of fantasy that in the middle of the night, you know, when you walk by someone's house and you see that blue glow of someone watching TV. So I imagined that in the middle of the night, all these TVs on the sidewalk would start to just light up and fly away like fireflies, like they'd been liberated. So that's what this was. And I performed as well. I had my television repairwoman uniform, and I had gotten the list of all the stations in Canada and what time they were shutting off, because they all shut off at different times. And I had the list, and so throughout the course of this, this was Art in the Open in PEI, it's their version of Nuit Blanche, people could come up to me, tell me where they lived, and I could tell them exactly what day and time they would lose the signal. And through that and social media, I coordinated to get recordings from each time zone in Canada, people recording their TV at the moment that it cut off. And it was during the Olympics, and it's really quite post-apocalyptic. You're just like watching the Olympics, and all of a sudden, it just goes to snow. Then at Viva Art Action that same year, I did a performance called Last Days of Snow, The Begending of the Universe, where I worked with a cosmologist who walked me through all the physics formulas that kind of prove that 1% of that radiation is part of the residual radiation from the Big Bang. And I memorized the key points in the electromagnetic spectrum from the Big Bang and Planck time down to microwaves, which is snow. And so I had water running down the back wall, and I slowly squatted down while singing this and paired it with images of home movies of my mother and I at the ocean and underwater footage of swimming, because I was interested in the parallels between waves in the ocean, waves of water, and these invisible air waves around us all the time. So air waves and water waves. So then around the same time, I was living in Sackville, New Brunswick. And this is where things start to get real. So I took a radio building workshop and built a radio out of a toilet paper tube. And my little radio played Italian radio. And I thought, whoa, I did a great job. Turns out I didn't really do a great job. I was just next to incredibly large international shortwave transmission site that was broadcasting around the world. And I found out that some people in Sackville, New Brunswick, which is a relatively small town, if they had copper pipes in their house, their pipe would act like an antenna. And if there was a badly soldered joint between two different types of metal, that would make a diode, and the sink became a speaker, like a gramophone speaker, and they would hear the radio in their sink. And I was jealous because my sink didn't play the radio. And you can't just go buy a Sony Syncman. So what I did was, I took the schematic of a foxhole radio, so it's what we got down here, the type that would have been built during the war in the trenches, where it's just wire, paperclip, it's relatively simple, and I translated it into plumbing. And this is the Marshland Radio Plumbing Project. I didn't have a grant. I was working at an artist-run center. You know how it goes, overworked, underpaid at an artist-run center. And everyone has their vices, and their money sucks. And I, some people smoke, some people have cable TV. Every paycheck I'd buy another 12 feet of pipe. I'd go to the plumbing store and buy 12 feet of copper pipe, which for the 1.5-inch stuff, these big ones, that was about $80 for one of those. So over the course of a summer, I spent several $100s on my radio sync. And I would take it around the marsh and try to pick up the radio and do different sort of configurations. And I even drove into the transmission site where the technicians worked and asked them, where should I set up my sync to get the best reception at which time? And oh, and yes, what happened was, because Sackville is a relatively small town, word got out. There was an article about me in the paper, and if I was doing groceries or at the cafe or the pub, people I didn't know would walk up to me and say, hey, so did you hear the radio in your sink yet? I'd be like, no. And then they would start offering these amazing stories about hearing the radio in their fridge, in their toaster, in their radiator. So I was like, I've got to capture this. So I started carrying a sound recorder, and I started taking my sync to public events. So this is the Sackville Fall Fair. It's an agricultural fair with tractor pulls and stuff, where I would bring it out and people would be like, oh, what's this? And I'm like, it's my radio sync. Oh, you're the sync girl. Let me tell you about when I was a kid. And they would start telling stories. So when the sync gets exhibited in galleries, I show it as a sculpture. And I also show back here, this is all the data that I had. So I've got a topographical map. I learned that when I went to the RCI site in person, especially if I went after 9 o'clock, there was usually only one person working and they were bored. So if there was nothing going wrong, I could go inside and we'd go down to the kitchen, have a pot of coffee, roll out my map. And this kind of circle you see in the distance here, it's 50-kilometer radius around the site. Basically, anything can happen. That's the magic zone. And they printed off for me the schedules, not only of Radio Canada International's broadcast, but all the other sites, because that site was subcontracted by China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam. So they printed off all of the schedules, and then we crossed off all the digital ones, because my sync wasn't a digital receiver. It would only get analog signals. And then figure out which direction they were broadcasting and where I should set up my sync. So that's all this stuff that gets exhibited when I show the sync as a sculpture. And the sound recordings of the people I interviewed, I placed in the drain trap, so you can hear their voices coming out of the sync in a gallery. And here's on the map, these are the towers and their azimuths of when they're broadcasting to Europe, northern Canada and the Arctic, Africa, the Caribbean, Mexico. So, and all these little circles are places where I could physically get to with my sync, because it's a marsh and it's swampy and I couldn't get to, like here, I wasn't going to be able to get there. But so this was, and these would be some of like my little notes about where I could go, what's broadcasting. So I could say, okay, this one's in Arabic, this one's Spanish, English, French, no language on that one. So that was the Marshland Radio Plumbing Project. And now I'm realizing I haven't actually told you what this actual site is. And many people aren't familiar with it, even those of us who grew up around there. So I'm originally from New Brunswick. I left in the 90s, lived in Halifax, Vancouver, Amsterdam, then came back to New Brunswick, and still, I just assumed every town or every province had one of these sites. You grow up, this is like a landmark when you're driving home. You're driving home after a long trip, you come around the corner and you see this, and you're like, oh, I'm almost home. And you just assume every province has one of these. But as I started doing the Marshland Radio Plumbing Project with the sink, I realized how special this site was. So there's 13 of these towers, and the towers aren't the antennas. The towers are actually just support for the antennas. The antennas are the wires in between. And the towers, they're 400 feet tall. That's a 40-story building. And the marsh in Sackville is below sea level. So it's this completely flat, below sea level, saltwater marsh with these 400-foot tall towers connected by wires. And they are put there. It's the only site of its kind in Canada and one of few in the world. So shortwave radio, if you're not familiar with it, what it does is it ricochets between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere. And so that allows it to wrap around the planet. So unlike AM or FM that kind of only goes so far, shortwave goes long distances. Shortwaves, long distances. So they started construction in the 1930s and started transmitting during World War II. And Sackville was chosen because radio travels better over water and even better over salt water. So with the position next to the ocean, it was the best place to reach Europe and Northern Africa during the war and later during the Cold War. And also when you build an AM site, usually you would lay copper ground wires in the ground, these radials around the tower, to give what they call the ground waves just an extra kick. You know, you want to give them an extra push, so you put some copper in the ground. But a saltwater marsh doesn't need that because it's already got salt. So the ground is already extra conductive. So geographically, this location was the perfect place to build this site. So it's this kind of interesting symbiosis between natural landscape and then human-made industrial communication infrastructure. And they broadcast to Europe, Africa, Australia, South America, Mexico, the Canadian Arctic, the North, for right up until 2012. And here's what they look like at night. So those people who lived there, it was quite iconic. When you come home, those red lights, you could see them from so far away because it's so flat. So I became obsessed with the landscape and I was recording these stories. So then I decided, I think I should make a film. I'm going to shoot a 35 millimeter film. So I would camp next to the site. And I shot on 35mm film. Instead of hand processing, I wanted really slick, clean images. I was going to do a landscape film over 4 seasons and make this distorted soundtrack where those stories kind of get jumbled up with radio sounds. And, but after I started filming, well, just before I started filming, there was this kind of period where I think what happened first was Fox announced they weren't going to release any more films on film. It would all be digital. And I was like, well, that won't affect me. I'm an experimental filmmaker. And then Empire Cinema said, we're not going to have any more film. We're switching completely to DCP, Digital Cinema Protocol. It's like, that's not going to affect me. I'm an underground filmmaker. And then I had and then Kodak declared Chapter C11 bankruptcy protection. This is all within a few weeks. I was like, that's not going to affect me. I'm shooting on Fujifilm. Then I had a prize with Technicolor for processing. So I had a bunch of arts funding, a big Canada Council grant, and this prize with Technicolor. And I call Technicolor about my prize. I leave a voicemail. They usually take a few weeks to call back. Because I'm not a big Hollywood producer, I'm a little experimental filmmaker. This guy called me back within 5 minutes and was like, you haven't bought your film stock yet, have you? And I said, I just bought $26,000 worth of film and a freezer to put it in. And he said, we just got 2 weeks notice. And he said, we all knew film was going to disappear, but we thought we had at least 5 to 10 years. No one saw this 2 weeks notice coming. He said, the Technicolor, that was Toronto. He said, Montreal is operating till November. And then so I'm calling around, finding out which film labs around the world are still open, because I'm still determined to shoot on film. But I realized I'm going to have to probably finish digitally, because I knew this was going to be like a 1 or 2 year project, because I wanted all the seasons. And if this was happening in a matter of weeks, I said, the first thing that's going to go is sound. And this is a film about radio. It's got to be about sound. So I thought, okay, I'll shoot on film, transfer to digital, finish digitally. So I learned that whole workflow process. The week that I settled that and arranged to do my first film shoot on the site in Sackville, CBC announces they're decommissioning the site and they're going to tear it down. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm documenting a dying medium with a dying medium. It was not my intent. So over the course of the next year, I filmed the site in as many weather conditions as I could, and I structured it over 4 seasons. And I decided that I was going to include the demolition in my film. Now, my Canada Council report was due at a certain date, but I thought, how terrible would it be to finish a film like this, of this historic site, and then not include the demolition if it's a few months later? So I decided to wait. And normally you're not allowed to film demolitions because they're afraid you're going to catch an accident. But because of my Radio Sync project, I already had a relationship with the site, and they wanted to make sure it wasn't a political documentary that's going to critique the CBC or something. And I was like, no, I'm just the crazy sync girl. You know no one's going to watch my movie. Come on, let me film. And the guys at CBC were actually quite open. In fact, CBC Transmissions in Halifax said, yeah, I'm actually glad someone's documenting this, because even throughout the whole demolition process, there was someone from CBC English came by twice for like a little spot on the evening news. No, once for English and twice for Radio Canada, and just tiny little spots on the evening news. But I was the only one present for the whole demolition to film it. But it meant waiting 2 years. From the time they shut it down in 2012, the demolition was 2014. So I kind of felt trapped in New Brunswick. I was like, I have to wait. So what did I do while I was waiting? Well, the site was no longer functional, so I would park in the back roads in the marsh and take my sound gear and go onto the site from the back. So I would hike through with all my gear, because if I went in the front, I would set off an alarm. And I knew there was no more electricity, so it was safe. And so I would go and spend a lot of time placing contact microphones on the towers. So contact microphones turn vibration into sound. And if you think of like a guitar pickup, right? And so imagine that on a 400-foot tower in the wind. And so they made these really haunting drones. So I would record different parts of the towers. Here I'm doing the bass. Every tower had its own voice. And then, of course, just before the demolition, I asked if I could climb one of the towers. I didn't think the guy said, well, I'm not saying no. And I was like, oh. So I had to pass a climbing certification test and buy some very expensive insurance in case I bled on the tower, I guess. It was to protect them from me. And I climbed 2 of the towers. This is me on top of Tower C with contact microphones recording the sound from the top. Spoiler alert, sounds the same as the bottom. So, but yeah, that's 250 feet up. And I had GoPros strapped to my chest and my helmet. I didn't take the 35mm camera up because it weighs 50 pounds without film. And I would only be able to get like a 10-minute shot at the most anyway. And plus I kind of felt it would be, I felt it would be cliche. I was more interested in sound. But I did get some interesting photos, so I have a photo series that emerged from the cameras that I wore while climbing. And so these are printed as 12 by 12 inch photos on aluminum. These kind of geographical views of the site just before it was demolished, one of the last people climbing them. So these are a few more of those. And, oh yes, and also during the demolition, at one point I saw a pile of these radio tower parts in a field. And I said, so what are those for? And they're like, those are for repairs. I was like, well, you're not repairing anything now, are you? They're like, no, you want some? I was like, yeah. How many? It's like, 6. He's like, sure, come get them tomorrow. So I borrowed a pickup truck, went down, picked them up. And so that turned into this piece, which is called Radio Towers Like Wind Chimes. This is a version at the Confederation Center for the Arts Gallery in PEI, where I suspended each one from a single piece of aircraft cable. I worked with an engineer to make sure it's perfectly safe. Each of those weighs 300 pounds. And then there's a rear projection screen I built playing a time lapse of the moon rising and setting over the towers. So you get the red lights of the towers. Later on, when I showed this piece at the Beaverbrook Gallery in Fredericton, there was too much light for rear projection, so I focused on sound, and I built some handmade speakers. So these black things are speakers that I built that are all playing the contact microphone recordings. So I wanted to create this idea of something that's kind of whimsical and delicate, but also industrial and ominous. Like, it's kind of scary to walk in there among them because they are heavy, but you are allowed to walk in and it's totally safe. Also, while filming, there was this big hole in the road that over time, this is an example of something that I didn't intend to be an art project, but that became one. There's this big hole in the road, and I almost drove a little Honda Civic right into it. It's a lot bigger than it appears there. And, you know, the first time there was nothing there. And then someone put a pile of rocks. And then someone stuck this tree in it. Then someone tied the pink ribbon on the tree. Like, this is just a road used by 4-wheelers behind the site. And then one day I showed up and someone had stuck these poles in. And one of the stories I'd recorded was of people talking about how when they were children, when their mother put the clothes out, when the clothesline would roll, they would hear the radio coming off the clothesline. So I thought, oh, this needs a clothesline. So I went and bought some rope and some clothes and hung them up just as a joke. And initially just started photographing it with my cell phone every time I visited this site. But it stayed for 2 years. And so eventually I started using a DSLR. And by the time the site was being demolished, the clothes were all tattered and torn. So this was kind of an unintentional landscape intervention that just started because, and I include it here because it's, to me, it's something that, it's very important for me in my art practice, that sometimes I feel compelled to do something, and I think it's important to follow those compulsions, even if you don't know why. So yeah, these works are now in a couple of permanent collections. Oh, so I want to play a clip of the film for you so you can hear the stories from the actual locals. So we have a DCP, so it was shot on 35, finished to digital. So if you want to, Alex, if you want to cue up the first 2 clips from the DCP, we'll listen to some people from Sackville telling the stories in their own voice.
In 1976, I rented a house on Charlotte Street in Sackville with my then wife Janet, and we were able to receive radio from our refrigerator. Every time that we would open the refrigerator, we would get to see a radio, the International's broadcast signal, whatever was going on, like the news in Arabic. This continued on for quite some time, very mysteriously, but I understand it has happened to others.
When they turned their hot water tap on, they would get the sound of the radio coming out of their faucet, which I think is amazing.
Okay, I think that's enough. So next we won't play the second clip of stories. I'm going to jump to the demolition. So the demolition scene in the film, it's what I did, so the first hour and a half of the film, you hear stories of locals paired with landscape images. The last half hour, you don't hear anyone's voice at all. The last half, we're going to watch the demolition in just a second. So the last half hour, what it is it's all those contact microphone recordings of the towers. But every time a tower falls, I remove its recording from the mix. So the sound mix gets thinner and thinner and thinner. It's like they die. So when the tower falls, its voice, its contact mic recording is briefly amplified and then removed from the track. So we'll play that clip of the demolition now. That's the one that starts at 1:38. And actually, maybe if you can start from 1:39, if it's... So all those sounds are literally just recordings of the towers themselves that I made 2 years prior, putting contact microphones on them. Okay, I think that's enough for that. You'll be able to see the full film. It's 2 hours long. I kind of gave away the ending. But it's playing at Daisy Bao in their screening room from November 15th to January 28th. I think January 28th, but it opens on November 15th at Daisy Bao, so you can go and see it with the full experience there. If I could have the screen from oh, perfect, there we are. So that was Spectres of Shortwave, which then led me to Requiem for Radio. So at this point, the towers are gone, but I had this immense library of those sound recordings, which were really quite rich. And I had this idea of doing kind of a requiem for the towers. I somehow anthropomorphized them. At the time they were falling, it became quite emotional. So this first part is Requiem for Radio New Dead Zones, where Requiem for Radio has 5 parts. So this is New Dead Zones. I built a scale model of the site out of plumbing, so it kind of references the radio sink. And there's copper capacitance sensors. And this is at Nocturne, which is Halifax's version of Nuit Blanche. And there's 13 towers and 13 speakers, and there's a bunch of little huzzah boards and some electronics and Wi-Fi stuff going on, so that when you touch these capacitance sensors, you trigger the sound of that tower. So if you touch Tower Q, you trigger the recording of Tower Q on that speaker. Problem was that with this many people, everyone's touching them all at once, and it's like someone just leans on a keyboard. So what I did then was Requiem for Radio Full Quiet Flutter is a performance for theater that takes in all these other elements. So here's, there were 3 musicians, myself and 2 others, and each tower, I tuned it by using a hum remover filter backwards that maintained the ultra harmonics and subharmonics, because 13 towers is 13 notes. So it's perfect for a chromatic scale. So it goes C, C sharp, D. So we made compositions to play on them. And in the performance, we also had 5 radios. I'm trying to think of what we got coming up. Yeah, so the performance as a whole, there's Requiem for Radio New Dead Zones is the installation with all the towers. Requiem for Radio Deviant Receptions is a piece where I imagined all the other, because there aren't that many sites like this around the world. And I imagined that they were mourning their fallen sister site. I imagined transmitter sites around the world grieving. And so I worked with a friend, collaborator, composer, Lucas Pierce, on a piece. I gave him a bunch of elements and then commissioned him to do the composition. So it's a 5-channel sound piece. You heard part of it when you were coming in this evening. But instead of having it on 5 speakers, I bought airtime on 5 stations around the world and put an antenna on the roof of the building. And this is where my transmission art practice goes into transmission, using transmission in the spectrum instead of just being about it. So what that piece was I chose a requiem. I did a lot of research on different requiems, and I chose William Byrd's Mass for 5 Voices from 1594. It's mostly Latin. It's very haunting. I recorded a choir with 5 voices singing, but their voices individually. Gave that recording to Lucas. And then we only recorded the Kyrie because I didn't want it to be too religious. And so the Kyrie, the only lines in it are Christ forgive us. And so I thought, okay, that I can handle. And so then the rest of the Requiem, the Latin Requiem, was converted to Morse code. And then Lucas took my contact microphone recordings for the melody. And then I wanted some number stations as well. If you're familiar with number stations, they're spy stations that have been in use since the Cold War that still happen today, and they're very creepy when you come across them. It's like there'll be a little bit of music, and then some little girl just saying 5, 6, 12, 9, and then it repeats. And they're in all these different languages. So we got some recordings of those and put them in there. So Lucas made this 1-hour piece because you have to, when you buy airtime, you have to buy an hour's worth. And this performance was 1 hour, but we were only going to be using the first 10 minutes and the last 5 minutes. But it was transmitting the whole time anyway. So we had, on stage we had radios. We were receiving from Germany, Austria, Miami, Monticello, and Pirate Radio Boston. And then one night, Radio Free Whatever, which is another pirate station, joined in as well. So we actually had one of the tracks coming twice, because pirates are really fun to work with. They can be unpredictable. So this is the set. And this is us. So we were able to do more elaborate compositions. So there's 13 speakers, 13 towers in the space as performers. And then this piece with the theremin is a piece called Requiem for Radio Pulse Decay, where the theremin sends control voltage to some programs written in Super Collider and processing that triggers those same contact microphones along with these images. And that piece I envisioned, that was actually the first one. That one is, the idea was to conjure the ghosts of the radio towers with radio waves. I wanted to kind of have this solo piece where I could call up these towers. And then this was radio cowers, because around the radio tower site there were a lot of cows. And so this is an actual cow bone from a cow that lived near there that I learned how to make bows. And this is a 1938 Marconi radio. And the towers were built they started construction in 38. So the goal was to convert this cello into a radio that would actually transmit into this. And it didn't quite happen in time. And I'm not a highly skilled cello player. So for most of the performance, I screamed into the cello and ran it through effects pedals that went into the radio. Here's Laura playing Pulse Decay. And then we ended back on that sound piece. In terms of Pulse Decay, the theremin piece, the thing is this performance was so elaborate that, and I actually finished it just before moving to Montreal, so I haven't applied to tour it yet. It's all in a crate. However, Pulse Decay is small enough that I can tour with that solo. And I just performed in Winnipeg last week, a week ago tonight. And what happens with a theremin? So those of you who don't know, a theremin is an instrument with two antennas, and you just move your hands in the air to trigger it. And so the thing is that most people, when they would photograph the towers, would photograph this landscape view because it was so impressive. But as I was doing sound recordings, they each had their own voice. And so I wanted to give them each an homage and a portrait. So I tried to photograph each one as a portrait and then put its stats here and circle it on the map, circle it here, take a picture from where I did the sound recording. And so I'll just play you a little clip. This is the performance I had in Winnipeg last week. It's not mixed yet, but so I'm singing lullabies to the towers. So that piece went through, I've been performing that since 2014. That recording was from Winnipeg last week. And this photo is from New York this summer, from HOPE, Hackers of Planet Earth. And actually, just before, let's see, yeah. The reason, because one of the things that interests me is how we get connected with different communities. So with that international shortwave simulcast with those 5 channels, one of the things that happened was that within the shortwave community, there's these things called QSL cards that people, let's see, I think I have a picture of one. Yes, there. So people who listen to shortwave, since the 30s, if you hear some sort of interesting broadcast, you write to the station and you tell them what you heard, when you heard it, what kind of radio, what kind of antenna you had. And they send you a postcard that's very formal, like this. This is confirming your reception on such and such megahertz at something, universal time code on date, and they sign it. And people collect these cards. And I knew some people still did this, but I wasn't advertising that I was broadcasting. I bought that airtime for the piece in the theater. And so I was thinking, okay, well, this is, this is just, maybe someone is going to happen upon this broadcast, and whatever, they'll find it interesting. And I printed 100 of these cards, more like promo for my piece, like you do for gallery shows. Well, we did the show 3 nights, and the first night, before we were even done, there was a video on YouTube from the Netherlands of someone going, "What is this pirate broadcast?" And then on HF Underground, which is an online forum for people who monitor pirate radio stations, people were like, "I've got this weird thing with number stations on 11580. I've got it on 5140. And they're like, "Wait, they're not quite the same." And they start realizing that there's very similar broadcasts on 5 different stations that are synchronized, but they're not quite the same. And so there's this whole discussion. And in the shortwave world, a lot of people do Morse code. And so someone says, "I've translated the Morse code. It's in Latin. Does anyone speak Latin?" So then it wound up being that what wound up happening was the next 2 nights, people around the world were getting out 4 and 5 radios, trying to catch them all. And I got 56 reception reports. And people from China, India, Japan, Argentina, Brazil, Ireland, Greece, and they were writing to me with proof that they'd heard my broadcast, sending me audio recordings, sending me video recordings, beautiful poetic texts. Some of them are just highly technical. Others were like, one guy said, "I don't know much about sound art, but this is what I heard," and proceeded to write an essay describing the entire hour that he heard. So this was amazing to me, because all of a sudden I'm reaching an audience that I didn't actually intend to reach. And it made me think of how in contemporary arts, oftentimes, we're working within what is essentially a bit of a bubble within the contemporary art world. And how all of a sudden I tapped into this kind of whole other community. So then I was invited to be the keynote speaker at the International Shortwave Listening Festival last March, and met all these people. So it's the DXing community are people who listen to shortwave. And there's also this thing called slow scan TV, where they will actually pick up television images over radio waves. And so from that conference, I then got invited to the Hackers Conference, because radio and hacking are closely related. And I never really considered myself a hacker, but I was informed that apparently I am. So I performed there this summer. And then that is going to lead to something, well, I'll come back to the hacking conference in a second. This is the other part of, so that's me at the Hackers Conference. This is radio cowers. I was going to make these gloves that were transmitters out of cowhide, but instead I had a residency at the Wave Farm this summer, which is a place dedicated to artists who work with transmission arts. So I built the cello with a loop antenna for a body. So this is an AM radio transmitter. So there's no resonating body on it, and you don't plug into an amp. This is a prototype, hence all the electrical tape and alligator clips. But it transmits into a radio. And this is a very formal portrait that was taken by Vincent Lafrance, because speaking of tapping into other audiences, when I was at the Hackers Conference, I was approached by IEEE Spectrum, which is an international electrical engineering journal, who just wrote a profile on me that went online yesterday, and the magazine comes out in a few weeks. So this is the formal portrait of me and my radio cello, which doesn't even have a name yet, and I need to learn how to play it, or find some composers who will compose music for it. The other thing that happened at the Hackers on Planet Earth was I attended a talk by Dr. Chris Fallon, who's the chief scientist at HARP up in Alaska. And I'm just looking at the time. I was going to show you a quick clip of the performance, and because I'm at the point to talk about some upcoming projects. Do I have time to show a little 4-minute? Okay, so I'm going to show you a clip of the performance here that was, let's see. This is, let's see, how much was I going to show you? We're at, yeah. So this is the performance in the theater with the 3 musicians, and this will give you a sense of what it sounded like when we played the scale model of the radio tower site. Sorry about that. So skin contact with the copper pads on the towers is what's triggering the sound. So we would use our faces and our hands. And all of these sounds are those contact microphone recordings of the towers. Going to jump ahead a bit, so near the end things kind of come to a climax with multiple instruments, so you can get a sense of the theremin part here. So I'll just play you one more bit, is the sound piece, just about a minute of the, here I'll pull up a better image here. So the piece that was transmitted from the 5 different stations, I'll play you about, let's see, a couple minutes. So Alex, if you want to start the piece from 5 minutes and 15 seconds, the 5-channel piece. So what we have is, I got the people from each station to record their own voices calling out. So we would have had it on 5 radios. So here we've got 5.1 sound, because we're in a lovely theater. So pay attention to where the sounds are coming from, and you'll hear different voices from the different transmission stations coming from different corners of the room. And when we did the performance, they were coming from different corners of the world. So Germany, Austria, Miami, Monticello, and Pirate Radio Boston. So if you want to start that. hear some number stations now, the spy stations. Okay, I think that's good. So that's the kind of the nature of the piece. So that piece was, the actual composition was done by Lucas Pierce, a composer in Halifax, but it was done, we were in close communication. I gave him my contact mic recordings and the number station recordings, recorded the choir, got the guys around the world to record their voices, and that's what the people heard around the world. And so because of that, I got connected with the shortwave community, which then got me connected with the hacking community. And that brings me to the more recent projects. So before I met the folks in the hacking community, I was working on one that had to do with the body, because I was like, okay, I want to get away from radio. I want to be done with radio, but it's still wireless technology. I felt it was a little bit, well, quite problematic. All this information that we put up on the internet, you know, social media, all these, they own so much data about us. So I started wearing a Fitbit a few years ago and gathering the data and wanted to work on an algorithm that would modify my social media posts based on what my heart rate was doing at the time, and also generating music from my sleep patterns. And it's quite intense how much data is generated by these things. And so I'm just showing you this because we'll eventually come back to this, and it's related because it's all this wireless data that's out there. Like, this thing knows where I am at all times. Fitbit apparently also tracks sexual activity, but they don't tell you that, and it's not on the app. And they track it in the same amount of detail as the sleep stages. It's like light petting, heavy petting, so they know where, when, what intensity. So I'm gathering as much data from that as I can to make another project. And then also working with performance. Some of you may have noticed I'm missing a tooth. It's been quite a saga. So I started making a series of videos this summer called Mouthpieces, where I'm doing choreographies for my tongue, because I'll be having an operation on my tongue at some point as well. So I do these little dances for my tongue that will be restaged after the frenulum has been cut. However, so I started that. Then I went to the Hackers Conference, and that's where I met the chief scientist from HAARP up in Alaska. So HAARP is the High Frequency Auroral Activation Research Project. It's a site that was founded in the 1990s by the American Air Force, Navy, and DARPA, and in conjunction with the University of Alaska at Fairbanks. And up until 2015, everything was top secret, very classified research being done on satellite communications, surveillance, GPS, all sorts of stuff in the ionosphere. In 2015, the military kind of handed ownership over to the University of Alaska. And up until then, there's also a lot of conspiracy theories about the site. A lot of people saying, oh, they're doing climate weapons, they're doing mind control, apparently chronic fatigue syndrome is caused by this site, chemtrails, all of that. A few years ago, a couple guys were stopped in a car on their way up there with a car full of explosive and guns because God told them to blow it up. So it's been kind of shrouded in a lot of mystery because everything was so classified until recently. So, and this is the site here. So you would fly to Fairbanks and then drive another 4 hours. So this is 160 radio transmitters. It's the IRI, the Ionospheric Research Instrument. To give you a sense of scale, like that's a pretty large building. In terms of ionospheric research laboratories around the world right now, this is what there is. The ones with X's have already been decommissioned. Question marks are ones that may be decommissioned. The only one that's for sure going to stay is in Russia. And this is the power level. So HAARP up in Alaska is currently the most powerful radio transmitter in the world. It's mostly being used by plasma physicists to study the ionosphere. They use the HF radio waves, so high frequency radio waves, to heat the ionosphere, just little bits of it. to study things like climate change, like the aurora, like how changes in the ionosphere affect communication and surveillance. During Dr. Follin's talk at Hope, he talked about how this is one of the artificial air glow experiments where they send, they heat a small portion to make artificial aurora. Now that's too small for the human eye. You need telescopes to see it. And he said, well, wait a minute, we're sending up radio waves. Maybe we can embed some information. So they embedded the university logo here. So you can see this is the quality that it was downloaded. They also tested the Luxembourg effect, which is something they noticed in the 1930s where you send up frequencies on 2 different tones. They get mixed together in the ionosphere and then received on one frequency. And so they tested that with DTMF tones, as well as with Row, Row, Row Your Boat. And then there was, I believe, a kind of a rock and roll version of the Star Spangled Banner was sent up. And these would have been received by DXers, the same sort of radio enthusiasts who had picked up my Requiem for Radio transmission. They also sent up this cat picture. So the first giant cat pic sent up with a giant radio transmitter. So this cat picture was embedded in that false aurora you just saw. So you can see this is Dr. Follin's cat. This is his QSL card. That's his call sign. So, and this is the quality that it was downloaded in. So during his presentation, he said, well, if any of you want to send something up, let me know. And I was like, I mean, cat pictures and national anthems are interesting, but I'd like to do something maybe a bit more poetic. And so I said, hey, could I send something? So we've started talking. And so maybe it's premature to mention it, but I'm pretty excited about it. So I've submitted my first Canada Council application for it last week, applying to SSHRC for November 1st. I've made contact with the engineering department here at Concordia, as well as a few other collaborators. So trying to put the wheels in motion to work with them to create a piece. And they seem to be excited as well. They've started telling me what they can and can't do with the transmitter site, about splitting the array of 160 transmitters into 80. They've never transmitted video before, and they're excited to have me create a video that would go up at very low resolution. I'm excited about how it'll be distorted when it's received. I'm also excited about connecting with these new audiences. So I've gone from kind of the contemporary art world to then connecting with the shortwave world, the hackers, and now, if I think about this, not only will shortwave listeners be tuning into this, but the American military. This is a former military site that's still used for military research. So whatever, if I get the funding, whatever I send up, a part of my audience is going to be the American military, which makes it very heavy. It's like, okay, this is serious. I have to make sure not to mess this up. But I'm very excited about this possibility of connecting with using contemporary art in ways to connect with very different communities and audiences. And yeah, so that's what I've been doing. I'm going to pull back to one of my images here. We don't want to end on the tongue here. Let's end on something nice with there we go. I've done that. So yeah, that's the transmission art side of my practice and where I'm going next. So here we go.
Well, best use of the space in the Sika series.
But,
As long
yeah.
as I've been around. That was so wonderful.
I-
It was gorgeous.
Yeah, I heard there's 5.1 and DCP. I was like, oh, I can use those.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So much. That was lovely. Guys, I've got a microphone for questions. Let me run it out to you so that you can get the questions recorded.
I usually
We're
speak on
very
it too.
concerned with transmission.
Oops. Yeah.
What's up?
Speak on it.
Oh,
Oh yeah, any questions? And I think that Tamara was, oh yeah, there we
Yeah.
go. We have a microphone
Sorry.
to pass around. Questions, comments?
I'll get us started. You're not opposed to spoilers, you said.
No, not at all.
So what are you thinking about sending up for the military or seed? Or is it early days?
I
for
think
that?
it might be a little early days
Yeah.
for that, especially considering, this is going to be possibly recorded and online. I think I'm going to keep a
Oh,
lid
right,
on
right.
what,
Mhm.
I'm not entirely sure yet. I'm also what's important to me as well with the project with HARP is that I want it to double as an actual scientific experiment as well. So at this stage, I'm trying to figure out what the site is capable of and how can I make an artistic work that is an actual viable scientific experiment that references the history of the site. I feel like in terms of symbolism and content, it's very rich, like talking about things like communication, surveillance, but also, because of all the conspiracy theories, end of the world, but also things like climate change. It is located up in the north, war, but also the paranormal. People say that ghosts, if you believe in the ghosts, that they travel in the AM bandwidth. So the working title right now for the project is Ghosts in the Airglow. So working with these kind of metaphorical, symbolic themes, but it's still very early days. Tamer's getting his workout.
Hey Amanda, so I was wondering, because you used like actual music, putting quotations on that, to mix with these more like natural sounds or things that you get from the earth, and I was wondering what your relationship to music is and like why you connect the two. I mean, they go well together, but yeah.
Yeah, my relationship to music. I mean, I grew up, I studied a little bit of music, years as a child, piano, singing, guitar. I stopped playing when in my early 20s, various, hang-ups that we get. But I kept doing my own soundtracks for my films. But I stopped playing music publicly. Like I used to when I was in my early teens, my late teens, early 20s, I would busk and I played in bars, like punk bands and stuff. Then I stopped playing entirely except for composing for my soundtracks. And I kind of felt, and then I started hanging out with like people with their doctorate in music, and I was like, oh, well, gee, I don't have a PhD in music, so who am I to be a composer or make music? So, the imposter syndrome crept in. So when I first made Pulse Decay, the piece with the theremin that triggers the contact microphones, I really felt like the value in the work was only in its concept, that it's, this, and it was really loaded with concept and content, and then the technological interface. And I was like, oh, I'm not making music, I'm performing. And it was only this summer that I brought in my voice. And also in Requiem for Radio, the Full Quiet Flutter performance with the voices, we sang in that as well. I started realizing that, oh yeah, I do have some background in music, and music, it can be quite beautiful. So actually the piece with the theremin, Pulse Decay, I'm currently planning on trying to work on an album for next year, because it just, like, recently, I used to always introduce that piece by explaining everything it did, and audiences after I performed was like, we just want to enjoy it, don't tell us what it does. I was like, oh, I thought it was only valuable because of the concept. And so I've started trying to embrace music as a part of my practice. I don't need a doctorate in music to make music. So, yeah. And it doesn't, yeah, and I like making music out of sounds that I find around me. So, yeah.
It's funny to ask you a question in a microphone sitting right in front of you, but
I'll talk back in this microphone.
So I noticed a theme of ghostliness, morbidity, the Requiem. Those themes particularly were connected to the radio and the transmission work, and so I wonder if that's a thematic that you like working with in generally, or if that just seems to be most fitting to the transmission works.
It does seem to come up in my work. It's funny because I don't intend to put it there, but I've had, I didn't talk a lot about my experimental film practice, but I had been told in the past, I remember once someone said, oh, your work is all about destruction and death. And I was like, what? No, it's not. And then I looked, I was like, oh my gosh, I guess it is. And then a student who was doing her MFA at Guelph had interviewed me for her thesis. And she was telling me how she saw all this stuff about the occult in my films. I was like, really? I didn't really mean to put that there, but so it seems to be something. And also like the paranormal, like when I titled the film Spectres of Shortwave, I was referencing the book Spectres of Marx by Derrida. I was like very academic, and and then someone brought up the paranormal, and I was like, oh, I don't want to go there. And then I was like, well, so at this point with the Ghosts in the Airglow, now I'm just like, okay, let's just embrace it. Just gonna bring the supernatural in. But it was never really the intent, but it seemed to just kind of emerge.
Wow.
Oh, see.
Thank you. That was a great talk. very layperson's question, but so you're transmitting 5 radio channels. There are tons of radio stations, and so how did all those people find it? Like, were they code breakers who were listening for the canceled stations, or like that just seems like a wild coincidence to me.
Well, this is the DX community that I discovered. There are people who, and it was fun because when we started preparing for the performance, like I wasn't a shortwave listener really before I started doing this. It's amazing what you pick up at night. So there's people who have shortwave radios, and mine's back in New Brunswick, but hoping to bring it up again. It travels better at night, so you pick up more stations at night from around the world. And so just like some people, you could flip through the channels on your television or on Netflix, you can tune through the radio station and you can come across various international stations. You can come across air traffic control stuff. A friend of mine the other night sent me a video of his radio playing numbers, and I said, oh, is that a number station? He said, no, that's an American nuclear missile silo. I was like, what? He's like, yep. I was like, can I use that recording, or is that bad? He's like, they're on public airwaves. Like, so when you have a shortwave radio and you scan through, you come across Morse code. So ham radio operators, when they talk in Morse code with each other, there's regulations about what they can and can't talk about. And sometimes, like when you decode it, it's like, oh, this guy just told the other guy he had pizza for dinner. Like, they're just chatting. So you come across, or it can be serious. So you come across Morse code, you come across air traffic control, like aviation weather, military communications, missile silos. Like, it's, so those were the people who came across. And so, like you, when I bought the airtime, I knew I was on unused frequencies. And so again, I thought people would have a schedule and tune in to what they wanted to listen to. So the only people who would find me would be people who accidentally found me. At the time, I didn't know that there's people where that's what they do. And once I discovered it, I was like, oh, that's actually really kind of cool. And it's also the fact that it's all out there in the airwaves, and it's in real time as well. When you watch live streams on the internet, they're actually delayed often by 20 to 40 seconds. So that, and this is regulated by the FCC and CRTC, it's so that if something happens they don't want the world to see, they can shut it down. So either a tragedy or something like that. But shortwave, it's instant. It travels at the speed of light. It's the electromagnetic spectrum. So everything you're hearing on those airwaves is the speed of light. It's like real time. So there's something really fascinating about that. I kind of answered your question, veered off. All the way in the back corner. And then next it's going to come back down here and then back up there.
Hi, Amanda. I'm just curious about the tongue piece that you showed very briefly,
Yeah,
but
just like
I was
that.
immediately transfixed by because it seems so joyous in relation to some of your other work, which had those tinges of morbidity. All your other work seems to go through these different transformations from sort of the beginning source. You start with the radio towers, and then you end with sort of a stage performance of some variety. I'm curious, do you have any ideas where the tongue piece is going to transform to, or is that too early days as well?
Well, that's also, it's funny, it's interesting to hear you say it's joyous, because it's about something that I've processed in my life that's very difficult. The tongue piece was supposed to have 3 different videos, and they were supposed to be short and sweet. When I work on really big long-term projects, part of my art practice, the way I can keep myself fresh and not lose hope in the world and life and everything, is to have these small little punctuated projects that are short and sweet and easy, so I can be working on the big heavy stuff and then do something short and easy. So Mouthpieces, which is the tongue video, was going to have 3 parts. So I'm getting a dental implant. So one was going to be called My Dentenna, and I wanted to connect a radio antenna to my implant. Because when we were working on the performance, at one point we were having trouble getting reception. We had backup FM transmitters in the theater just in case we couldn't get the international ones, because if there's sunspots or storms, you don't get reception. So our FM transmitter wasn't working, and as a joke, I touched one of my teeth and it came in totally clear. It was like, So we had this cute little 4-minute video of me putting this thing, and it wasn't this tooth, it was another one. So I thought, oh my gosh, I'm gonna have a piece of metal embedded in my jaw. Yeah, that has to, I'm a performance artist and I need to connect an antenna to that. Well, when I told the surgeon, he was like, no. don't do that. Why would you do that? And I actually consulted with an electrical engineer and with a researcher at Mount Sinai who specializes in electromagnetism in the human body. And she was like, yeah, as long as you don't transmit more than an hour a day, you should be fine. But the electrical engineer said, yeah, just make sure to put a capacitor between the antenna and the battery so you don't get a current causing electrolysis and a gas bubble in the implant. I thought, oh my gosh, this is so much expense and time and money. I don't want to mess it up. So I am going to do the antenna video, but I might not actually touch the antenna to it. I might kind of describe the process. The tongue-tied is the ones that I showed you. It's a series of photos and videos because I am tongue-tied, but I never knew because I didn't have a speech impediment. And they think that's why I have all my jaw problems, that I've been making micro adjustments in order to talk. So apparently I'm going to have the frenulum cut, and I don't know if I'll have to learn to talk again or not. So it could wind up being very morbid when I do after that surgery. So I'm trying to kind of, in order, that levity is kind of to help me get through it. Like I had a false tooth I was wearing, but it caused jaw problems. So as of last March, I couldn't even wear the false tooth. And at first I was totally ashamed. I was like, oh, this is terrible. I'm like, no, this is how I look. And you know what? I can light inside my mouth better because I'm missing a tooth. So I'm going to make the best of it. So I light inside my mouth and do little tongue dances. And then the third one, I don't know what it'll be. I've been keeping all of my x-rays and data from the dentists, and it's been very frustrating. So the third one might be very autobiographical and painful possibly to talk about. And I'm thinking of relating it with the Fitbit piece. When I was talking with this researcher, we were talking about how, because I've also been gathering other biological data. I submitted myself to a clinical trial a few years ago for MRI scans of my brain. So I've had 3 different hour-and-a-half-long MRI scans of my brain, 6 weeks apart. Last year, just before I lost my tooth, we found a tumor in my left breast. It's not cancer, but so I had a biopsy, and I convinced the pathology lab to give me my tissue sample. I was like, that came from my body, I want it back. And I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm thinking it has to do with control of our body. Like we try to control our bodies with these like Fitbit technology. Oh, I'm going to be fit, so I'm going to wear this thing. The whole quantified self movement is about knowing yourself through numbers, right? So it's all about controlling your body. But then this idea of how much medical stuff is out of our control. Our body does things we don't really want it to do. And also, once you put yourself in the hands of doctors and surgeons, you hope they have your best interest at heart, but maybe they just want the money, or maybe they're just treating you the way they treat everyone else. And in some ways, they're kind of like meat mechanics. I'm the meat machine and they're the meat mechanic, and I'm not a person to them. I'm just the next meat machine in a row. And it's actually quite kind of painful and unpleasant psychologically and emotionally. So I think the third video of the Mouthpiece series may be very autobiographical and dealing with not only the mouth, but also maybe the tumor, the MRI scans, and these questions of trying to have control of the body, and who has control of our images, who has control of our data, and what are they doing with that data, and what does that mean for how we live in this body that, and who's actually controlling the body and the data from it, I think. But again, early stages. And yeah, how that turns out will all depend on how this goes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. It's so inspiring. And I wanted to refer back to what you said, that follow your inner voice intuition, that made like all of this come to life actually because you went with it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm more curious, it's a practical kind of question as a researcher artist. Did you have a research question before listening to this inner voice?
I think the first research question was, can I make a radio out of my sink? That was the first one. And then I never told you, it never worked. It didn't. Technicians told me it would if I had another 40 meters of pipe. 40 meters is a lot. So it started with that question. And then from there, I just kind of followed my compulsions and into places where maybe I was not skilled. So I learned how to make contact microphones. I started taking cello lessons. I learned how to clean bone. That is disgusting, but I've learned how to clean animal bones. And then learned how to climb a radio tower, which is terrifying. And a lot of the things I do, sometimes I forget that I'm afraid of things because it's all a concept. I'm like, this is going to be great. And I'm like, shit, this is scary. But I'm started down the path. So it's, so it's more, it started with a question, and then it was a matter of kind of being true to where I felt it needed to go next. But I do believe in rigorous kind of research and stuff. So like when I did start down the path, Requiem for Radio, start off, I'm like, oh, what a beautiful title, Requiem for Radio. Thought, I don't have a music background, I need to learn about Requiem. So I went and researched as many Requiems as I could, listened to as many, realized a Requiem has 12 movements. And I was like, oh, there's 13 towers. I want 13 movements. Oh, I'll add movement 0 because I'm using computer coding, and computer coding, you always start counting at 0. So from 0 to 12 gives me 13 movements. So Requiem for Radio actually had my 13 movements, but it was still structured. Every movement was structured along an actual part of a traditional Requiem. So each time, so I follow the compulsion, and then I go, okay, now what do I need to do to really be true to this? Like, I don't just do it whimsically. Like with the clothesline, when I realized no one was taking it down, I was like, okay, I'm bringing a DSLR, and I'm like printing these archivally. When they said, yes, you can climb, I was like, okay, I'm going to get my certification. I'm going to buy the insurance. I'm going to get a harness. Like, so it starts with a question, then there's the compulsion, and then it's like, now how do I honor this compulsion by going, and that's where I am with HARP, with the thing in Alaska, is like that question that Tamer had is, what's it going to be? I'm at the point of going, okay, well, what's it capable of? What is its actual history? What was this site used for? What are the conspiracy theories? Who is my audience? How do I make the best because I'm probably never going to get a chance to do this again. It might be torn down in 2020. Like, I have basically a 12-month window. And so how do I make the best use of this thing? You know, the first artist to use it for video, if I get the funding, but, you know, and with that kind of an audience. So it's like, okay, what's my due diligence? How do I do this? And also, who do I need to help me do this? Because even though I oftentimes work alone and work hard and burn myself out, I also go for help when I need it. I hire technicians when necessary. I hire mentors. I hire teachers. And then bring on collaborators, like composers and collaborators. And this will be my first time collaborating with No, actually, I did work with engineers before, but I think I'll be working closer with engineers on this one because of, as I was talking with the scientist from HARP, we were Skyping, and I would ask a question, he would answer, and I would be like, oh, that's actually, I'm pretty technical, but so I was like, that's a bit over me. If I stand on my toes, I'm not quite. So that's where, I'm hoping to work with some engineers on that. So find the people I need to help me make sure the work is everything it can be.
Anyone else? Ryan's got one over there too. He can pass it over. Maybe one question about technique and themes to follow on Alexandra's question about the towers and obsolescence as a theme in the work, or mourning really as a tone in the work. I was sort of compelled by how natural cycles and cycles in the birth and death of technology are connected in the work, especially in the TV work, the analog TV work, the white noise is connected to the birth of the universe and so on. And that added some levity to the project. That of birth was a topic in the project, added some lightness, and the performance was light. The work on the towers was more of a mourning work. It was about the loss of the towers and obsolescence at the start. Do you think about emergent technologies or play with that as well? And do you think the tone of the work would change if you were focused on new technologies, not outmoded technology? Sort of thinking about David Ross's work with drones, film work with drones. The tone is very different, and the technology is emergent and new.
Although I think that's where I was trying to go when I started the project with the Fitbit, right? With all of this biological data that's being gathered. I was actually trying to get away because all my work, my experimental film practice was, some people would be like, oh, this was done in the 70s. Why are you doing this? I'm like, but I'm interested in it. Doesn't mean it's done. And so I was really trying to kind of work with emergent technologies when I started looking into, and I built some of my own biosensors, but I was also interested in these commercially available things that interface with iPhones and stuff. But then the thing with HARP came up, and then also they may or may not exist after 20. I'm like, as soon as I get involved in a project, like analog TV, when I started the last days of snow, they hadn't yet announced that analog was going off the air. The shortwave radio towers. I'm like, oh, sorry guys, your site in Alaska. It may still be there, but so yeah, there's the stuff with the Fitbit technology. When it comes to emergent technology, I actually feel it's almost more morbid because of the way that they are appropriated by, capitalist corporations and controlling us. And so for me, that's actually much darker. Part of my interest in what are considered obsolete technologies is the fact that so many of them are so much more durable. For instance, that site in Sackville, people don't realize how fragile the internet is. It can be taken out quickly. Like there are cables under the ocean that at one point they were Russian submarines parked next to them. They cut those. That's a big part of, like satellites and, the internet is fragile and it can be censored. And then you have this shortwave site that to rebuild it, like it's there, it was there and it existed, but to rebuild it would be, I think they said $38 million. And they're not going to rebuild it. But if the internet went down, that was a perfectly solid way to communicate. And the other thing is that people in remote regions who don't have access to the value of shortwave is that people who either don't live somewhere with satellite service or the financial means, because you can't build a digital receiver like you can a radio receiver. But also authoritarian regimes censor the internet regularly. Look at China, Korea. Shortwave always gets through. And there was a charity in the United States that would send those hand-cranked shortwave radios to third world countries and authoritarian regimes so they could get objective news from outside their country. And the democratic voices on the air was BBC, Radio Canada International, and Voice of America. Well, Canada's gone, BBC's torn down their site, so Voice of America is now probably the only democratic voice on the shortwave airwaves now. And I think that, so I find it a bit problematic when they're called obsolete technologies, because I think that we're calling them obsolete before they are, because we live in a culture that is so obsessed with the latest and the greatest. We're like, we have to get the next upgrade. I mean, case in point, my little MacBook Pro she's a 2009. She's almost 10 years old. And I'm like, no, she still works. I had to reset her PRAM just before this talk, but she still works. And I think I have a problem with disposable culture and this whole, like, we're going to move to the latest thing because newer is always better. And I think some of our older, and also why I filmed on 35 millimeter. My 35 millimeter camera is, I'm not sure what year she is, but my Bolex is a 1947. I have a 1947 Swiss Bolex for my 16 millimeter filming. And it works fine, and I don't have to do any software updates, and it's mechanical and it works. So I feel like they're not obsolete. They've been put to pasture too soon and they're underappreciated. That's my little rant.
Yes.
Oh, wow. Could we pass that down to Jacette?
And Tamara, I think there's someone right there too, next to you.
Oh, geez. I'm sorry. She will come back.
Thank you. I was just curious to know if you could talk a bit more about your experience working with different specialists. I mean, how were the questions received, and how do you know who to contact? I mean, do you only contact people you already know, or do you sometimes go on the internet and find a specialist on a specific subject you want to know more about? How involved are they in your project, etc.?
Yeah, okay. So it varies. So there's some who are collaborators that I'm close with. So for like Lucas, who composed the Dead Air Requiem, which is the 5-channel piece. We've been friends a long time. We've collaborated on many projects. I know his skills. We share a similar aesthetic. We're co-authoring a paper now. So there's collaborators like that. Then when it comes to technicians, sometimes it's kind of, I have to kind of laugh because it's yeah, like with the RCI site, when I was doing my sync and I was wondering, is this going to work or not? I found out you could just drive up to the site, and they sometimes gave tours. So I drove in unannounced, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I got a tour. And one of the guys knew someone that I knew at Strutt's Gallery, and he was like, oh, well, we're working now, but if you come back at 9, so I would like drive in at 9 p.m. because then there was only one person working, and I knew he was a technician, and so I would talk. So it was kind of this thing where I just like showed up and I was like, hey, so you know how this works. And that kind of happened there. Here, so this is the first time, and then when I needed engineers for hanging, or structural engineers for hanging the radio towers from the ceiling of the art gallery, those 300-pound ones with the aircraft cable, that was a friend of mine who's a civil engineer. So just kind of, I was like, what kind of anchors do I need? Very minimal stuff. For what I'm about to do with HARP, the way I was like, well, I work in the EV building at Concordia, the Engineering and Visual Art building, and I'm not sure how to go about this collaboration. And it was the week before classes, and I have a heavy teaching load, and I know if someone sent me an email out of the blue, I would not answer it. I was like, man, if I send an email to someone, it's going to get lost. So, and I said, I don't even, and I asked Dr. Fallon from the University of Alaska, I said, okay, this is over my head. If I'm going to collaborate with a scientist or an engineer, who do I need to work with? I don't even know what specialty I need. And so Dr. Fallon said, what you need is someone who does signal processing, propagation, plasma physics, or aeronomy. So I thought, okay, where do I start? So I walked down the hallway. I'm on the 6th floor. And I walked to the engineering side, and there's the office. And I walked in, and I said to the receptionist there, so it was civil engineering. I said, does Concordia have an electrical engineering department? She said, yeah, 5th floor. I said, okay. I walked down to 5th floor, walked in, and I said, do we have any faculty who specialize in signal processing or propagation? And she said, 1 second. She wrote down 5 names. I went to the hallway. One of them was the chair. I thought, oh my gosh, it's the week before classes. You can't just walk into the chair's office unannounced. That's really bad form. I walked down the hallway to see where his office was, and the door was open. There were a bunch of students in the hallway, and I thought, oh my gosh, do I just walk in? Is that rude? But if I write an email, he doesn't know who I am. So I kind of I walked past his office 3 times, and I poked my head in and I said, hi, I'm going to send you, I'm not going to take much of your time. I'm going to send you an email, but just wanted to introduce myself first. He's like, okay. I was like, I'm a transmission artist. I teach in intermedia. And I start talking about HARP. He's like, who are you? I was like, oh my gosh, I'm failing at the introduction. So I introduced myself, talked about the project. He's like, yeah, we've got 10 people who do that kind of work. Will you present at our faculty meeting next week? So that was 2 weeks ago. So I presented to the engineering faculty a bit about the project. And I've had about 5 or 6 people approach me. I've had a few meetings already. So at this point, I'm just seeing who's there, who's interested. They're also probably seeing who I am, like how much of a freak is she, what's she actually going to be doing. So I think we're kind of like doing that little dance of seeing who's going to work with who and how and what's going to happen. So I don't fully know yet, but I'm quite optimistic and excited.
Thank you.
Dawn, can we take 2 more
Yeah.
questions? Okay.
You've been talking primarily on technical and technological considerations. I'm wondering if you can say anything on aesthetic issues, and are you actually trying to deal with new possibilities in the use of sound? Are you talking about different uses of the human body to produce art, etc.? So can you say something other than just the technical issues, although they were interesting, but nevertheless, I'd like to hear your ideas on a little wider horizons.
Yeah, that's a good question. I do often hide behind the technical stuff. Yeah, in terms of sound, like I was thinking of, I didn't even say, I thought it kind of went without saying the like working with the multi-channel simulcast was obviously a nod toward Janet Cardiff's 40-part motet. You know, it's, I find that sort of taking a work of music or art that has a long tradition, like the choral piece, the Requiem, and translating it into a new medium, there's something haunting about it for me. And so in terms of doing new things with sound, my approach seems to be to try something new technically, and then I like to be surprised by the result that may or may not be interesting. So for instance, aesthetically, when I talk about the work that I'm going to do with HARP, the video, and that distortion that was in the cat picture, for me that's an integral part of whatever video I'm making for HARP. Aesthetically, I want to make something that will have this sort of, because so much technical stuff is so much about control, for me aesthetically, I find that a moment just at the end with a lack of control, of uncontrolled interventions from the technology is something that I find interesting. That in my experimental film practice, I worked with a lot of strange chemicals where I didn't know what the outcome would be, and so making a video that I know will not be received the way I make it. So therefore, aesthetically, I have to think, okay, well, I want to make something where the essence will translate beyond the distortion. So my aesthetic, and the same thing with the composition. When Lucas and I were working on that 5-channel composition, aesthetically the thing was, okay, we have to make this piece where if someone only hears one channel, it still sounds like a complete artwork, but if they hear all 5, that it works. We have to make something where if they're started slightly out of sync, it still sounds intentional or like something. So my aesthetic approach is often to work with a process where there's an element of the unknown and the uncontrollable that comes just at the end. So from the beginning, I try to approach the aesthetics in a way that I'm preparing something that I know will be disrupted and distorted, the audio and the image. And I try to embrace that in the final work. So I try to make something knowing that by allowing for that distortion, that's the point where I can step back. I know it's still kind of technical and probably not as aesthetic as you wanted. Yeah.
No, but I was curious to know how you viewed these issues, whether, when beyond just the question of how to achieve them, whether you had any other ideas of why you were doing the work kind of thing and what you were trying to express.
So in terms of expression and an approach to that is, for me, I try to make work that deals with heavy issues, but in ways that I believe in a lot of subtlety and things being translated through ambiguity. So I guess that would probably be my aesthetic approach, is I try to take these really big issues, like the end of a technology or climate change or the paranormal and all this stuff, and to frame it in a way where ambiguity is kind of, and I think that's why I was interested in the concept of snow and the noise between the television channels and the distortion, is because I feel like a lot of meaning comes through in the ambiguity, that sometimes the less information, the more meaning, in that I can tell you I'm going to the store to buy a carton of milk, and that gives you a lot of information and you might have a clear picture. But if I just say I'm going to the store, you don't know, am I going because I work there? Am I going to rob the store? Am I going to buy something? So I like to create works in terms of content and both content and aesthetics that have a certain amount of ambiguity, that leave a lot of room for the viewer, the listener, to enter and to extract things. But I don't know, I feel like I'm rambling a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great. One more question? Can you handle it?
Sorry, last question. I was just wondering if there's anything we can do, like anyone we can message to help you get your funding, because I would really love to see your work come to life.
I think I'm waiting for the Canada Council answers are out in February, and if I get my SHIRK Partnership Development Grant in on time, then those answers I think are in the summer. So I think it's expensive. 1 hour of transmission time on HARP, like the shortwave stuff was, in the US it's $150 an hour, and in Europe it was 150 euros an hour. So I spent a few $1,000s on that, and the one with HARP, it's $5,000 an hour to transmit. So my Canada Council application was $100,000, because we're talking transmitter time, we're talking trips to Alaska, which is not cheap. So I mean, I appreciate your offer to help, but I'm not sure.
He's taking donations of copper pipe.
Yeah, donate copper pipe, bring me your pipe.
Amanda, we need to thank you for such a wonderful presentation. One of the SICA students, Amra, in a discussion a week ago, said super high-tech art reminds him of something a friend said about Hemingway. He was all technique looking for a subject. I feel like you invert that. There's so much technology in your work, but so much compulsion and commitment to a subject, and you find the technique as you go. It's beautiful presentation, beautiful work, and thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you.